Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this post-Brexit clinic that we're running here at Queen's as part of our post-Brexit governance NI project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. My name is David Phinnemore. I'm a Professor of European Politics here at Queen's and overseeing the project. And I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Katy Hayward, and we're going to be talking through various aspects of the recent developments around the protocol. And we obviously are doing that on a quite important day in Northern Ireland politics, and we'll see what the outcome of that is. We're also talking at a time when the UK and the EU seem to be going through a period of slightly better relations than they have done for much of the last 2 years. But obviously at the centre of that relationship are still ongoing disputes around the project. What we're planning to do today with you is to look at the recent opinion polling that we've carried out and the report which we've published on that today. That's what we call our Testing the Temperature project. We're looking at what voters in Northern Ireland think about the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. But before that, what we want to do is run through a bit of an overview of what has happened since we had the last post-Brexit clinic back in July, to see some of the developments within the UK-EU relationship around the protocol. And then once we've been through the findings of the opinion polling with you, we do want to spend a little bit of time just looking at two important pieces of UK legislation making their way through the Houses of Parliament. Those are the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill and the Retained EU Law Bill, because they have quite significant implications for the protocol. I think it's only fair we give those some attention today. Okay, so I'm going to kick off by saying a few words around what's been happening with the protocol. It's been an eventful 3-4 months since we last met. We obviously had Boris Johnson resigning as the UK Prime Minister. And what we also saw, however, was the continuation of essentially a bit of a standoff between the UK and the EU around the implementation of the protocol. That said, gradually over time, a bit of an improved mood between them coming to the fore in sort of September and through to today. Okay, so in many respects, little has actually been happening with the protocol. The focus of the UK-EU relationship has been essentially talking or pronouncing on their different reservations around the way in which the protocol is being implemented or not, and how it should be implemented. And then also that taking place in a context where we still haven't got an executive in Northern Ireland. But over time, during the summer, the UK and the EU gradually coming closer together and wanting to re-enter discussions on how to resolve outstanding issues around the protocol. In the midst of this, we've obviously had the publication of this Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which I mentioned earlier. We had the EU responding by launching some new infringement proceedings, and as the Protocol Bill made its way through Parliament or through the Commons over the summer and got its second reading and was approved and then moved on to the House of Lords, the EU responded with some further infringement proceedings. Now, one could argue that this is just complicating the relationship further and represents an increase in the standoff between the two sides on the protocol. But as I said earlier, as we move through September into today, what we're probably seeing is a shift in the mood music around the protocol and around UK-EU relations, such that there's some optimism around about the possibility of talks leading to some sort of resolution of the outstanding issues around the protocol. Okay, now that has been very much associated with the changing government, with Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister. But as we're well aware, she's now departed office, and we've got a new Prime Minister. And during that period when Liz Truss was in, not too much attention could be given to the developments around the protocol, essentially because of the political turmoil which existed in the UK. That said, as you see from this slide, this sense of an improved mood music has been reflected in the fact that Maroš Šefčovič was indicating that checks on goods entering Northern Ireland could be reduced to a minimum and done in an invisible manner. Seemed to be a slight shift in the EU position, encouraging the UK to respond. The UK has responded to infringement proceedings, indicating that it wants to maintain the status quo for grace periods. And what's interesting about this is the EU has not actually pushed back on that at the moment. and indeed has not rushed to respond on the responses from the UK around the infringement proceedings. So suggests there's a sort of shift in the mood, a desire to create space to engage on finding a resolution to the issues. Okay. What we've also seen is James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, and Maroš Šefčovič speaking, and both agreeing that they need to focus on looking for solutions. This comes against the background of 7, 8 months when there was very, very little top-level engagement between the UK and the EU on the protocol. We've also seen Northern Ireland Secretary of State Chris Heaton-Harris talk about UK-EU talks being reopened with gusto, possibly an overstatement, but nevertheless a sense that the mood has shifted and the UK and the EU are in the room. However, this is taking place against the ongoing process of the UK government taking the Northern Ireland Protocol bill through the House of Lords. And I think it's fair to say that there are a good number of concerns on the part of the EU around what the Northern Ireland Protocol bill would mean for the implementation of the protocol. But we'll come back to that later. Cleverly and Šefčovič have at least had further talks, stock taking where things are. And then we've obviously had the resignation of Liz Truss as Prime Minister and her replacement earlier this week by Rishi Sunak. Still to be seen what the incoming Prime Minister will mean for the relationship with the EU and the extent to which some of these protocol issues can be resolved. Okay, so I mentioned infringement proceedings. They're important because they highlight the extent to which the EU believes that the UK is not complying with its obligations under the protocol. And as you see there's 7 infringement proceedings which have been launched or relaunched over the summer. Important to say there that there isn't a process ongoing whereby the UK is engaging in responding and the EU is then considering the responses which the UK has provided. That's quite quiet at the moment. There's not much news around that. I think a reflection of the fact that neither side really wants to politicise this process too much at a time when it could disrupt what seems to be this improved mood music. What we also have to note, however, is that despite this improved mood and some talks, the institutions of the protocol are essentially not operating. There's been no meeting since February of the Joint Committee. There's been no meeting of the Specialised Committee on Ireland and Northern Ireland. Essentially, the UK-EU talks taken outside that framework. The principals have not necessarily been engaging to the extent they were last year with stakeholders and business representatives, formally at least, to the extent that they might have been. And obviously, without the Assembly up and running, there's been no appearances by either Šefčovič or whoever's been Foreign Secretary before MLAs. That said, it's important to note that this Joint Consultative Working Group, which is monitoring the legislation which applies under the protocol, it has been meeting monthly and has been engaging, seeing the UK and the EU engage on discussing some of the implications of new legislation coming through from the EU for Northern Ireland. Okay. I think it's the wish of both sides to get back to a point where the institutional structures operate, but I think before that they're going to need to resolve outstanding issues. On those outstanding issues, there's little to report in terms of substance. It's more about process and incremental steps. Back in June, July, the concerns were that the UK and the EU were essentially talking at each other or past each other and needed to get back into the same room. Both of them were saying about we're willing to enter negotiations or enter talks, open to doing so, but they hadn't actually got into the same room as yet. The important thing now is that we're at the stage where they are in the same room. Indeed, talking, taking stock of issues. They're tweeting fairly amicable pictures of one another, smiling. But this doesn't take us away from the fact that there are still quite significant issues to be resolved. And although both sides probably have awareness of what each other are looking for, gaps still remain. And we've yet to see any news or hear news of any narrowing of those gaps. That's what the focus is of the talks at the moment, proceeding very much at a technical level. Okay. That said, mood is slightly positive. We actually saw, was it yesterday, the new Prime Minister and Ursula von der Leyen speaking with one another, both issuing statements which were talking about finding joint solutions and looking for sort of degree of stability and predictability, and Maroš Šefčovič chipped in as well. So things are pointing in the right direction, and one could say there's a sense of optimism or a mood of optimism around. With the opinion polling, which we'll come on to in a moment, we took the opportunity to ask the question, to what extent do people feel optimistic about an acceptable resolution of outstanding issues being reached? Here's the findings. Okay, more people are optimistic than not. However, that optimism is not shared by a majority of people, or majority of our respondents in Northern Ireland. 46% are broadly optimistic, but 34% do not disagree with this statement that they are optimistic about an acceptable resolution. We'll have to see in due course whose views are reflected best here, and will we actually get some sort of resolution? Something which I think we'll probably want to track over time, because I think given the way things are going at the moment, we shouldn't necessarily be expecting any imminent resolution to these issues. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Katy, who's going to start taking us through some of the findings of the polling.
Thank you, David. So actually there's a mistake on that slide. It's the Testing the Temperature 6 poll, which was taken on the 7th to the 10th of October. So these pollings take place over the weekend. And basically there's a set of questions that we consistently ask in every poll, and then we ask some new ones. So I'll go through the ones that we traditionally ask, and then tell you some of the other ones that we added in this time in relation to sources of information, for example. So first and foremost, the questions on the opinion of the protocol. So we see 53% saying the protocol is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. And we also, which is very similar to last time's results. And we also clarified this time round the question of what protocol we're talking about. So with the grace periods in effect, the protocol provides the appropriate means for managing the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland. So 54% agree with that statement. A clear majority of 70% say that particular arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland. This is a figure that we've seen quite consistently over the past few polls. We see a majority saying that Brexit is not on balance a good thing for the UK. And then we asked the same questions on whether people's understanding, as they see it themselves, of the protocol is good. A clear majority, 74% saying that they think they have a good understanding. Although that question of whether they think reliable information is available, that's only 44% saying that. Now that we've done 6 such surveys, it's possible for us to look across since spring 21, so when we did that first poll in March 21, and see the patterns of change. And just to keep you on your toes, the colours are reversed in this particular graph, so apologies for that. So at the top we have those who strongly disagree that the protocol is on balance good, and at the bottom we have those who agree that the protocol is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. So we see that reflected there. There is that slight majority who say the protocol is on balance good. What is interesting in that is around 30% are strongly of that opinion, and that's almost equally matched by those who strongly think that the protocol is not on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. The difference between the two, and why we have a majority of those saying the protocol is on balance good, is those who agree. So they're not particularly strongly of that view, but they do agree. And we've got a quarter of our respondents saying that. Whereas those who think the protocol is on balance a bad thing, but who are not particularly strongly opinionated on that, that's only 8%. So this suggests that those who have a negative view of the protocol are really strongly of that view, whereas those who think it's on balance good, there's a mix of those who really passionately feel that and those who kind of just moderately feel that. And consistently there are around 8% of those who are neutral or say they don't know. Then we have asked consistently questions around the impact of the protocol, and the pattern is fairly, almost exactly similar to the pattern we've seen for several of these polls now. There's a slight reduction in those who say that it's having a positive impact on the economy. That had gone up for the last couple of polls, and that's down a slight bit. but it's still a majority think that it is, on balance, having a positive impact on the economy. Very much when it comes to the political dynamics, political stability, British-Irish relations, UK-EU relations, the view is primarily a negative one. We also see the plurality of people thinking that it's having a negative impact on Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market and a negative impact on the Northern Ireland's place constitutionally in the UK. And you'll be familiar with these questions too. We ask, who do you trust? How much do you trust these people to manage Northern Ireland's interests on the protocol? So consistently for a long time, we've seen that business reps are the most trusted when it comes to managing Northern Ireland's interests on the protocol. By far the least trusted is the UK government, although we should note that trust in them has gone up from, I think it was it 6% last time, to 7% this time, but still a clear majority, and almost half strongly distrust the British government with respect to the protocol. We also ask in relation to parties, and you can see here there isn't any party who's doing particularly well. Alliance and the SDLP are just about more trusted than they're distrusted, but it's not a super happy pattern. For the Irish government and the EU Commission, the findings on these are usually fairly closely matched. So we have 47% saying that they trust the EU Commission, but 43% saying that they don't. This is just a different way of presenting that data. And if you look at that column with respect to trust minus distrust, you can see there quite how much more people distrust the UK government than they trust it. The Northern Ireland Executive trust in that is far lower than it would be trusted, and perhaps that makes sense given that it hasn't sat since February properly. Those who distrust the DUP compared to those who trust them are also much more numerous. And if you look all the way down to the bottom, you can see the particular findings for business reps. So they are considerably more trusted than they are distrusted. Then we've asked a set of questions around voting on the protocol, and this is important, of course, because of that democratic consent vote that happens at the end of 2024 in the first instance, and that vote by MLAs, whether the Assembly is sitting or not, those 90 MLAs will have to cast a vote on this, and it's whether you have the full application of the protocol, i.e. including Articles 5 to 10, so specifically the rules relating to goods moving with the Irish Sea border, or whether that is disapplied, and so that vote is quite close, just 50% saying that they want full application. That's slightly down on last time round in our last poll. 41% saying they would want their MLAs to vote against. That's very slightly up. So you can see that's setting out those questions as we've asked consistently since March last year. But the pattern is remarkably steady, especially when you take into account the margin of error is plus or minus around 2%. Now we decided to add some possibilities in here in the next question when it comes to people's support for the protocol, because of course at the moment the UK and the EU are in talks to try and minimise the impact of the Irish Sea border, minimise checks and controls. As David has said, the EU has been quite clear that it wants to do that. As well as the UK is seeking for that to happen. So we brought this into consideration, and it's quite interesting that here you see an adjustment. So it's gone up to sorry, I'm rapidly calculating. So 49% saying that they would support the continued application of the protocol. And this is if we have that agreement between the UK and the EU on reducing checks. What's interesting here is that you have people, we offered these options to people say, well, it depends on what the impact would be. So you can see consistently there's around 3 out of 10, 28% here, saying regardless of what happens, they do not want to see their MLAs voting to see the continuation of the protocol, Articles 5 to 10, but others would be willing to change their mind on that. So it depends on what that meant by minimal checks. It depends on the implications for Northern Ireland's economy. So that considerably increases the support for the protocol at that particular vote, up to so an extra 28%, sorry, on top of the 41% who are of that view anyway. Now we come on to these new questions around information on Brexit and the protocol. And this is something that's been asked of us, and maybe we've talked about in Brexit clinics before. Because we know that people think they have a good understanding but consistently say reliable information isn't available, we thought, well, let's just try and see where they access information from. This is quite difficult to assess because you're always working here within the limits of such a methodology. So we weren't able to ask, for example, a particular type of news program or particular specific program, just asking very generally here. So bearing that in mind, this is the sort of the headline finding though. And we see that most frequently access sources, radio and television news programs, but that's closely followed by talk and discussion programs, of which Northern Ireland has plenty, of course. And then third most frequently accessed as sources of information is political parties that people would consider voting for. Official websites, including those from Northern Ireland Assembly, for example, academic websites such as our own, other sources are less frequently accessed. And then obviously there's the question of how frequently do you access, but also then how reliable do you consider the sources to be? And what is a really fascinating result, we think, is how reliable people think that political parties are as sources of information on Brexit and the protocol. Now, notably, these are political parties that people would consider voting for, but 76% are saying they would consider them to be trustworthy in that respect, which is really interesting when you consider back to people's confidence or otherwise in political parties vis-a-vis handling Northern Ireland's interests over the protocol at all. So the fact that this is political parties they would consider voting for is really significant. So this shows us that people are very much influenced by parties that they would support when it comes to positions on the protocol. And this possibly explains quite a lot when it comes to why we are where we are in the protocol discussions here in NI. And then before I hand over to David to talk about unilateral action, just a couple of slides on people's views with respect to the operational scope of the protocol. So again, we asked this question last time. Do you have any concerns at all about the full operational scope of the protocol? And slight reduction, but still about a third of voters saying, actually, no, we don't have any concerns at all. So that possibly reflects, do you remember those at the beginning we were saying a third, about 30% of the view that strongly thinking that the protocol is a good thing, that's possibly reflected here. When we break it down, these are issues that have been raised by the UK government in their command paper last year of issues that are of concern. We see the issue of most concern. So overall, the proportion is 36% of our respondents, and it's 64% of those who say they have concerns. It's in relation to customs declarations for parcels. Now, this isn't implemented at the moment. The UK government is not doing that. It's part of the protocol that hasn't been implemented, but people would have concerns. It's the issue of greatest concern for those who have concerns around the protocol. Of least concern is Northern Ireland aligning with the EU standards on the production of goods. And then we come into questions of, well, what would make a difference in people's views on the protocol? So a statement provided the UK and EU agree further flexibilities. The protocol could be good for Northern Ireland in the longer term. And so hence we're seeing an increase there to 62% saying they think that with flexibilities, the protocol could indeed be good. A very different question is obviously in relation to where we are. And about whether the protocol is an issue that should be holding up the establishment of the Northern Ireland Executive and power-sharing institutions. So 66% say no, the Assembly and Executive should be up and running without the protocol having to be scrapped. But 30%, which is quite a significant figure, saying that it shouldn't be established until the protocol is scrapped altogether. Now, bear in mind that neither the UK nor the EU are talking about scrapping the protocol altogether. This is a very notable finding, and it relates, I think, to that 30% that we saw at the beginning who say the protocol is on balance. They strongly think it's a bad thing, and they're strongly of that view. And then this is the flip side to that question. So the executive should be fully functioning regardless of what happens on the protocol. 65% saying yes and 32%, so almost a third, saying no. So again, we can see there's a significant portion who are clear that what happens in relation to the protocol should have knock-on effects with regards to the power sharing institutions in NI. One last question that we added in the context of quite a lot of US interest recently in Northern Ireland. And so we asked whether people think US government pronouncements on the protocol and the 98 agreement have been helpful. And it's literally even split here. 44% say yes, 44% say no. So I don't know what that tells us, except that's another polarizing issue in NI. Okay, I'm going to hand over to David now to talk about unilateral action.
Okay, thanks, Katy. Before I do, can I just encourage anybody who's got a question to put it in the chat, and we'll pick up on that as we go through. Okay, so on unilateral action, we're probably all aware that for about the last 16 months or so, the UK government has been indicating that it is prepared to take unilateral action on the protocol to address the concerns, particularly around the movement of goods into Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. That threat of unilateral action was taken a bit further when the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill was published earlier this year, which essentially envisages the option for ministers in due course, if the bill is adopted, to unilaterally disapply core elements of the protocol. And as I mentioned earlier, the EU, probably for good understandable reasons on their part, did not welcome this and indeed began then to either relaunch infringement proceedings or bring some new infringement proceedings to the fore. Okay, so what are the attitudes of people in Northern Ireland around this question of unilateral action? Well, we asked 3 questions related to this. We asked whether the UK government would be justified in taking unilateral action to disapply core elements, even if this is a breach of international law, because there's a strong body of opinion out there which indicates that, or suggests or argues that the Protocol Bill, if it were adopted and were implemented, and these decisions were taken by ministers to disapply, then that would be in breach of the UK's international obligations. We also asked whether, if the UK did take retaliatory action, potentially suspending the trade provisions of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, whether people would agree that the EU would be justified in acting. And then final question we did ask was whether a negotiated EU-UK settlement of outstanding issues regarding the implementation of the protocol would be preferable to the UK taking unilateral action. Okay, so in terms of the findings there, you see it quite clearly there that 6 out of 10, 59% of people in Northern Ireland who participated in this poll disagree that the UK would be justified in taking unilateral action. But nevertheless, you've got more than a third there agreeing that the UK would be justified. I think when you think back to some of the polling, other findings we've presented here, you'll be aware that there is a 25-30% strongly opposed to the protocol. One can assume that those would be people who would be often supporting this sort of line that the UK would be justified. Okay, so if the UK did take unilateral action, would the EU be justified in taking retaliatory action, including that possibility of suspending trade provisions in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? Here, we've got 52% of respondents indicating that the EU would be justified in such action, and 37% indicating that they don't think the EU would be justified. Now, whether we get to that stage remains to be seen, but I think it's clear where the majorities lie in response to these 2 propositions. Okay. Clearly, when we ask whether people would prefer to see a negotiated EU-UK settlement of outstanding issues, there is considerable preference for such an outcome as opposed to the UK government taking unilateral action. 71% of people would much prefer the UK and the EU to negotiate a settlement here. As I said earlier, the UK and the EU are back in the room. They are talking, they're scoping the issues, they're trying to identify some ways forward, but there's no guarantee necessarily that they will achieve such a negotiated outcome. But clearly, a negotiated outcome is the preference of the majority in Northern Ireland. Okay, that's a quick run through a lot of the findings of the poll. What we also have done with this poll and with previous polls is give respondents the opportunity to provide written comments in response to the poll. And what you see here is the fact that we had 3,000 people participate in the poll. 17% of them spent time on providing comments to us on, in some respects, the poll, the questions they were asked, in some respects, in more respects, the sort of comments generally around Brexit and the protocol. So clearly people have got views and are really willing to express them. What we see there, and this charts the responses that we've seen across the 6 polls to date, is where those comments lie. What are the issues which people are doing? What's the nature of the comments that are coming back? As we've seen across all the polls, most people expressing or providing comments are expressing a negative view of the protocol, shortly followed by those who actually see the protocol in a slightly more positive way. As in line with the last number of polls, there's been quite extensive criticism of the DUP in the comments, and also 10% of people, 13% this time, expressing concerns about the lack of a Northern Ireland executive. And then you see down there other issues which have been coming up across the 6 polls. Obviously, what we've seen this time around is some people engaging with comments around the need for reform of devolved government. In some areas, issues which have had salience before have decreased in terms of the comments that people have been providing. Now, colleague Lisa Whitten has been doing some analysis here of the findings some analysis of these comments, and basically she's identified sort of 5 broad categories of responses. In terms of those who take a broadly positive view of the protocol, we see 3 categories where people are indicating that they believe the protocol to be positive and beneficial, and you see there the comment that we selected to represent this position. Then you've got a category who see the protocol as positive and potentially beneficial. And I think this is reflected in some of the comments that Katy was making earlier about how people might change their view on the protocol if checks and controls were reduced to a minimum and if it was seen to benefit Northern Ireland. A lot about the potential benefit there. And others adopting a slightly more resigned position, saying actually, well, the protocol's positive as essentially the least worst option. Northern Ireland's in this position, but this is a reasonable, if not necessarily a position they would necessarily want to endorse wholeheartedly. It's something which they can possibly live with. Okay. In terms of those who are expressing negative views around the protocol, we essentially see 2 broad categories here. One where the responses are based on the effects, the experiences of the protocol, and you've got there a quotation there from someone who runs a small business, someone who's feeling negative consequences of the protocol, and because of that is opposed to the protocol. Then you've got the second category amongst those who with a negative opinion of the protocol are those who simply refer to it in reject it in principle. And I think it's interesting just looking at the comment there. It's brief. And I think one of the striking things about a lot of the comments is they are very short. It is scrap the protocol, do away with the protocol. And that is basically coming through as a matter of principle. Okay. So I suppose the question going forward is if attitudes are to change on the protocol, it's probably very difficult to see those with a opposition in principle shifting position. But there may be, if negative effects of what we're seeing can be mitigated, whether there may be some movement in terms of those who are opposing the protocol because of its effects. Equally, if the protocol is to retain the support of those who see it as potentially positive and potentially beneficial, then there's got to be some sort of resolution of the outstanding issues so that those potential benefits could potentially be realised. Okay. So challenges there, but I think that's point to make here is these aren't necessarily representative samples because and we do see a high proportion of people responding from particular political positions. But I think these give a fairly good sense as to the range of comments that we're receiving back to the polls. Okay, on to the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. The retained EU law. I'm looking at Katy. Did you want to take on this one?
It's okay.
Okay.
I'm happy to.
All right. Okay. As I said, we've done the polling. We're giving you a bit of background on where we are with the UK-EU relationship. We've also mentioned the fact that there's two important bills going through Parliament. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which, as you'll see there, is now at the committee stage in the House of Lords, so it's been through the Commons. The retained EU law bill is a slightly earlier stage, having simply had a second reading in the Commons recently. Still got to go through committee stage, so still a long way ahead. The reason for flagging these two bills is that they both have implications for the protocol, understandably in the case of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, but also the retained EU law. And what we want to do is spend a little bit of time just sort of going through some of the issues that these bills raise and the questions that they raise, and giving some sort of sense as to the extent to which these might be addressed in due course. Okay. I think the starting point for the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is the position which Liz Truss adopted, and that is that, okay, although there is a preference for a negotiated outcome, the UK has indicated that it must be able to take action to look after what it sees as the interests of Northern Ireland. And to that end, not only is it wanting the UK-EU, if the UK-EU does not change the protocol, it wants to proceed with this Northern Ireland Protocol Bill and the power that it gives the UK. The bill has been put forward on the grounds of necessity to protect the 1998 agreement. And there is a debate around there as to whether the necessity grounds really do exist, but those are the grounds which the UK government has used to justify the bill. Now, the bill has quite significant consequences for the provisions of the protocol, insofar as it does enable a minister to disapply key elements of the protocol, including on, as you see here, movement of goods, regulations of goods, tax, VAT, supervision arrangements. It's important to note, however, that not all elements of the protocol are directly covered by the protocol bill. So, for example, the provisions on rights, the provisions regarding the common travel area and north-south cooperation. So as such, the protocol bill wouldn't scrap the protocol, but nevertheless, given what's possible under the protocol bill, it would take out significant elements of it. And this is why the EU argue that the protocol bill would breach the UK's international obligations. Okay. Very useful slide here, which has been pulled together by a colleague, Simon Usherwood, with some help from Katy, summarising the bill and the range of effects that it would have. And you can see they are quite extensive when one thinks of the content of the protocol. Okay. I think it's also fair to say that the concerns about the protocol bill that have been raised also extend to a number of other issues, particularly to do with the extent to which powers are invested in a minister here, so-called Henry VIII powers which are available. Okay, so you see there on the bottom right there, the bill would give ministers the power to also fill those gaps created by the exclusion of certain provisions from the protocol through secondary legislation. And one of the key arguments which a number of parliamentarians have been making is that, okay, this can be done without parliamentary scrutiny or approval. Okay. Question then is raised, okay, what do you actually fill those gaps with? And this is where we've got the UK government through the bill indicating that it wants to introduce this dual regulatory regime and the idea of green-red channels for the movement of goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. I think it's fair to say that the bill lacks the detail, and the UK government, I know, has been consulting over the summer on what a dual regulatory regime might look like, what the implications are, how green-red channels might work, and what the implications of those would be for people moving goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. One of the key concerns is around this dual regulatory regime is that if goods entering Northern Ireland do not meet EU standards, then it's not going to be possible to use those goods in the production of anything which does go into the EU market from Northern Ireland. Hence concerns being raised in certain sectors about the implications of such a regime for continued access to the EU market, and with that the access to the Irish market. And I think it's fair to say, as the discussion has intensified around what these regimes might look like, what this green-red channel system might involve, and how much it will actually free up the movement of goods, quite considerable questions have been raised about the viability of some of this. That said, this is the UK government's approach to resolving the protocol issue, or the outstanding issues around the protocol. That said, the language that we see there on the left from Liz Truss, which has now been replicated by the new Prime Minister, is that the preference is for a negotiated solution. I think for the time being, however, we can fully expect the UK government to proceed with the protocol bill through Parliament. As I say, it's in the Lords at the moment. How easy it's going to be for the government to get the protocol bill through the Lords, given the extent of opposition and the questions being raised there, remains to be seen. Okay, in terms of the other bill that we want to flag, this is the retained EU law bill, which was published recently. Some people refer to it as the Brexit Freedoms Bill. It's often heavily associated with Jacob Rees-Mogg. And it's the idea of essentially removing existing EU law on the statute book from that statute book. And importantly, to do so by the end of 2023, and this now infamous sunset clause, which is in the bill. Okay, what's important here with the retained EU law bill is that it doesn't apply to EU law which applies under the protocol. Okay, but the concern is that this actually creates quite a considerable amount of uncertainty regarding the law in the UK, governing in particular the movement of goods and goods that can be sold. It also creates a whole series of other issues there, which have been helpfully set out there in a very useful House of Commons library paper. You'll see. Okay. We've also seen a significant number of questions being raised by the likes of the Hansard Society around what the protocol, around what the EU retained law bill will mean. You see down there, they've got 5 key concerns there. The first is around the automatic expiry of EU retained law, the so-called sunset clause, which essentially will remove Parliament's scrutiny and oversight role. It brings in an unnecessary amount of uncertainty, whether that be legal, economic or political. And there's also concerns there about the ambiguous wording of the EU retained law. I think the important thing from a Northern Ireland perspective is that there's enough uncertainty around the protocol at the moment, and there's enough complexity around what law does not apply, that to add in the complexities which the EU retained EU law bill includes would just intensify that complexity and uncertainty in Northern Ireland. And there's also then the question about what role is there for the Northern Ireland Executive and the Northern Ireland Assembly when some of their powers under devolution are being questioned through the retained EU law. You see the final point down there, the Hansard Society raised, there's potentially serious implications for devolution and therefore the future of the Union with this. Now, in some, as I mentioned, this bill is very much associated with Jacob Rees-Mogg, who now no longer part of the government. And I think it's interesting that news, I think this morning in the Financial Times, does suggest that the UK government is possibly easing off, as the headline says there, taking Brexit acts to EU law. That they seem to be sort of rowing back a little bit from some of the more controversial elements of this bill, and there's even a suggestion that the sunset clause might go. But at the moment, the bill is still going through Parliament, and we'll have to see what happens with it. If it does go through, then not only have we got the complexity of the uncertainty around the implementation of the protocol for Northern Ireland and what might flow from the Northern Ireland Protocol, you've got the added uncertainty and complexity which would be thrown up by the retained EU law coming into force and having the sunset clause see the disapplication of a lot of law in the UK and what that means for the the law governing particularly the economic activity in the UK. Okay. So potentially more complexity to what is already a complex and uncertain position that we face today. Okay. Now, I think that's all our slides. Plenty there for us to be, or for you to be thinking about. And we've had a good number of questions, well, a few questions coming through from people in the participating. If you have got questions, please do send them through, and we'll try and pick up on them. We've got one question here asking, are there any polls of people in Ireland GB in relation to the protocol? Is it not really a live issue for others, but it's interesting to see what their view is? Have we got any around the protocol?
No, the only research I would know about would be the UK and Changing Europe, one of MPs, when they were asking specifically about the protocol. I'm not aware of any in the south for sure, or any in the UK, I don't think. But that sort of, that reflects, I think, a lot of, very much thinking that the protocol is a Northern Ireland issue, and not something people necessarily need to get on top of in GB. But I will have a look. Yeah.
Okay. And then another one here, looking more at the sort of the process and where we are. What's the next point that we might expect to hear an update from the EU-UK negotiations?
That is a good question, because I think a lot of the context for the talks is helped by the fact that they're not giving regular sort of a running commentary and not talking to the press very much about it. That the idea is that at some point fairly quickly they'll be getting into technical details which require a bit of space to find commonality, and therefore such technical discussions can be thrown off a wee bit by too much observation, particularly given the political sensitivity of all of this. I don't know when I think possibly what we're most likely to get is, if we're lucky, is tweets like the ones we saw between Cleverly and Šefčovič. So when they meet, bearing in mind they're not meeting formally as a joint committee, as you said, that they're meeting informally. We're hoping those will be fairly regular, and that'll be the sense of if that relationship is still working, if the tone is still good. But I don't think we'll be getting much on the detail of the talks. The hope would be, if they're going well, knowing that there are some issues that they've been considering for some time, the green-red, for example, tariff rate quotas, for example, that has been in the news a wee bit. The hope would be, if those go well, then they will be able to make an announcement about progress on that. And there is a sense that those talks will continue, even though there's likely to be an election happening. Would they announce something before an election? Possibly so. But at the moment, we don't see any indications of expecting any big announcement soon.
Okay. We've been very, very much focusing here on what's happening within the UK-EU relationship. We've not spoken much about what's the extent to which the situation on the ground in Northern Ireland and the absence of the Assembly is feeding into the UK government's position, is feeding into the understanding on the part of the EU that, okay, there are genuine issues of concern here, and some people might say there's the future of the devolved government in Northern Ireland at stake here. How much do you think the situation here is resonating in London, in Brussels, in terms of defining the positions of the UK and the EU in this?
So I think it's difficult to say. I mean, we know that they're very conscious of how important the protocol is now for the political situation here. And this certainly gives a sense of urgency or significance to these talks. But in a funny way, the longer it goes on, and what we're seeing in the polling would suggest if they do come up with agreements, or even an agreement about several things, whether that will be enough to change the political dynamics here, vis-a-vis participating in the Executive and Assembly, etc., is a big unknown. This is a question of how much, I think, when the UK in particular tries to set its priorities in these talks, is it prioritising the practical effects of the protocol, as we saw, if those were addressed, then support for the protocol would increase. So is it trying to get sort of broader consensus in that way, or is it about the principal points, which would possibly be issues that would be most concerned to that 30% block or so, 25-30% who are resolutely concerned about the protocol? But the problem is if they focus on those issues of principle, they're not going to get very far in the talks, because those are the areas that, like, for example, the Court of Justice jurisdiction, that the EU will not move on, at least not in such a, at this stage where there's very significant doubts about the implementation of the protocol altogether. So yes, it does depend a lot on the UK's approach to these talks.
So there's another dimension there, and that is the extent to which the EU is prioritising resolution of the protocol because of the desire to see a better UK-EU relationship. That if we think about the situation under the Johnson government, essentially turning back on the EU, not wanting to have too much to do with the EU, Truss coming in, wanting to engage a little bit more. She went to the Prague European Political Community gathering, which is not an EU event, but it was the EU, its member states and other European countries. It was seen, I think, by a good number of people as this re-engagement with the EU. Also, the UK wants to resolve the issue around Horizon and access, and the EU is taking the position, well, we've got to resolve the issues under the withdrawal agreement, and that is it includes the protocol before we're willing to move on that. But also we have seen a bit more engagement on the part of the UK in terms of energy cooperation as well. So one sometimes gets a sense that whereas the sort of protocol has dominated UK-EU relations to date, there's a desire on the part of the UK to sort of move away from that slightly, and also get some resolution on that, which may need some degree of compromise, so that it can rekindle that UK-EU relationship.
And especially in the context of the Ukraine, like the security relationship is so important. That's been reiterated. Yeah.
Okay, a couple more questions have come through. Any thoughts on the possibility to call new elections and the impact of ongoing EU negotiations on voters? Who will benefit
from calling new elections? Nobody's a winner in this one, I don't think. I mean, it's an absolute fact that there has to be an election, unless we see a miracle by midnight. So there's no way of avoiding it then. We lose the caretaker executive tomorrow, and we can't have a new executive formed without a new election. So even if the DUP changed its mind on Saturday, whatever, it's too late. There has to be an election before we get a new executive, unless there's primary legislation, but that's not going to happen. So in that context of that election, you know, I would imagine we can see that, for example, the DUP polling like this and other sort of polling suggests that they are regaining support from their hardline is regaining support from their own supporters who thought it wasn't being hard enough. So the DUP would stress, I imagine, the protocol and the need for a hardline on that not to waver with respect to points of principle. But for others, obviously there's that wider question of where the DUP's position has left us, and that sort of would probably be, rather than a strongly pro-protocol approach for other parties, it would be much more, critical of the DUP, I would imagine. So in that respect, bearing in mind we'd probably be likely to have a low turnout in the circumstances that generally works against the smaller parties who would have an uphill struggle, I would imagine. So we're likely to see DUP Sinn Féin coming out very clearly as the largest parties, and it looks very unlikely that there'll be any change in the headline results, i.e. Sinn Féin would still be the largest party.
Another question come through: how vulnerable is the resolution of the protocol to multiple changes in government, both in the UK and Northern Ireland? And can we imagine a context where fundamental review or revision might actually take place?
So on the first question, it's a good one, yes. So I think whereas the EU has been more convinced that the UK generally wants resolution of the protocol issues, and this is in line with what you're talking about with respect to the slightly changed relationship around Ukraine, etc. So they do believe, yes, the UK is sincere, I think, in wanting change, but yes, can you then trust that the UK will be able to implement such an agreement? particularly given the dynamics here, and given the uncertainty and the flux in the British government. And I think even though we still have the same Foreign Secretary engaged in those talks, of course still we have the same Secretary of State, that we are sort of, I think, waiting for a bit of leadership from Sunak to see, is he going to be, he's repeating the same lines, they want the same outcome as the protocol bill would produce, but does that mean in practical terms, in terms of aspiration, or in the points of principle? And that would very much affect the prospects of them finding agreement. Yeah.
I think on the question of fundamental revision, what's striking is the protocol never included a revision clause. It's down to the Joint Committee to sort of review the implementation of it and what might happen around that. I think what the opportunity to sort of ease the implementation of the protocol and some of the challenges around that possibly comes when the UK and the EU review the trade and cooperation agreement. Insofar as there's an opportunity there to see what can be done within that relation, which might sort of facilitate trade, remove some of the obstacles to trade between the UK and the EU more generally, and then that would have knock-on effects for the arrangements East-West within the protocol context. And I suppose here there is the argument that is being put forward in some quarters that, okay, have we, with the demise of the Johnson government and now the Truss government, reached sort of the peak hard Brexit, and that actually, if there is going to be a slightly more pragmatic tone, will that move the government into contemplating a veterinary agreement, something more generally on regulatory alignment? Note that the only 24% of our respondents were concerned about regulatory alignment. If the UK government moves into that space, then some of the issues around the implementation of the protocol would be less problematic. But I think just going back to the protocol more generally, we're focusing very much on the trade dimension. There are other dimensions to it, the rights dimension, the North-South cooperation dimension, and the framework was meant to be sort of creating a framework in which to manage that. They've not been given much attention, they've not been given much space there's not much space for discussing those. And I think there are questions out there which colleagues in the legal community, colleagues who look at North-South cooperation, are raising about whether the provisions of the protocol actually do deliver on what the aspirations of the UK and the EU are there. So there may be some debate in the future around that. That would need the Joint Committee, specialised committee, to be up and running before I think that could be really be discussed. Okay. Another question coming in. Any comment that we've got on the potential influence of Macron's proposal for a wider European political community earlier this year on UK-EU relations and talks? One for me. Okay. I think that this is where you've introduced a framework in which the UK can engage with the EU as part of a broader set of relations with other countries as well. It's not engaging directly with the EU. Although the EU is the largest participant in the European political community, it's not a European Union run process. I think that allows, as we saw with Liz Truss's participation, an easing of the UK back into a more engaged relationship indirectly here with the EU, without necessarily making any concessions within the UK-EU relationships. I think it creates a way back in. The question then is how much can be made of this European political community when it's very much focused on addressing issues at a macro level, having a discussion. I think it's good for sort of rebuilding relations, rebuilding a bit of trust in relations. And so in that respect, it's probably a good thing. But as with so much within European integration, it does run the risk of being just a talking shop, and that the EU, whether we like it or not, is the dominant actor in Europe today. And I think the UK ultimately was going to have to re-engage with the EU more directly and in greater substance if it wants some of the issues in the relationship to be resolved. But I think the timing was good for Truss. It allowed her to engage with people, particularly having had a sort of fairly difficult period for the early part of this year, where despite the optimism when she took over from David Truss that the mood was going to change and there would be an opportunity for dialogue and discussion and hopefully the resolution of issues, nothing really came of that. Indeed, it came to a fairly abrupt end at the end of February. Okay. All right, a few more questions coming through. Let's imagine an agreement is found between the EU and the UK on the protocol. Do you think it will pass in Westminster? I don't think it wouldn't need to go through Westminster, because I think this is in the hands of the government. It'd be an executive decision. It would not need legislation. I suppose it does depend on what agreement is reached. At the moment, the EU position is we are not changing the protocol, and the resolution of issues can be found within the protocol. Okay, the UK government argues, well, no, we do need to change the protocol. The question then arises, well, if as part of some sort of package deal, some arrangement there were to be some changes to the protocol, that then raises the question whether they would need to go through Parliament. If there were to be a supplementary agreement between the UK and the EU to implement any changes, any new arrangements for the protocol, that would probably have to go through the European Parliament, certainly have to go through and the Council on the EU side. There then raises the question, okay, well, how would that have to be dealt with within the UK, and what process there would be? I don't think people have given paid much attention to that question at the moment, because we're still probably a long way from that. You've got to sort of get the agreement in terms of the substance. Yeah, good question. I think we'll find out if and when there is some agreement to resolve the outstanding issues. Okay. All right, I think we're nearly out of time. I've run out of questions here coming through. If anybody has got a last question, type quickly, and we'll come to it. If there aren't any more questions, I think it's worth telling everybody that we will be making the slide deck available online, as we'll be making this recording available. And if you do have any questions subsequent to the closure of this event today, don't hesitate to get in touch. There's the website there which will have a contact details, and we'll happily pick up on any questions people have. Okay, all right. No one's been typing particularly quickly, so I think what we'll do is we'll draw this to a close. Can I thank everybody for coming along, for being interested in what we have to say on this, and can I thank Katy for joining me on this, and we look forward to seeing people at some point in the coming months. I think certainly if there's some resolution between the UK and the EU, we will run a clinic around that, but we will be running our next poll, I think, in February, so we'll be back probably in March to report on that. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a good rest of the afternoon.